think Russia's feeling at the moment? How do you think, with all the sanctions against Russia, it's feeling at the moment? It needs peace.
The Prime Minister
can't continue this war.
The Prime Minister's talking about building up our arms industry.
Yes, of course.
We can't even police our own borders, for goodness sake. So,
okay,
it's a joke.
You always try and shift it away. When you lose the argument,
I haven't lost the argument.
Something else.
I'm talking about a peace deal. That's what I want to see. And I think if you ask most of the British people...
Don't you understand that a peace deal is something that lasts and not something that is simply a stopping of the violence for a few months?
Most of the British people, they will tell you they want peace in Ukraine.
Of course, we all want peace in Ukraine.
They want peace in Ukraine,
yes.
Barry. They don't want pensions not being kept warm. They don't want more money being sent to Ukraine. And by the way, you haven't answered. Labour will not answer and clarify that the overseas aid budget that you've raided won't be going to pay for the Chagos Islands deal with Mauritius.
Oh, nonsense.
Nobody will confirm that. So, look, the British people have been oppressed. They're being taxed into oblivion. The state's growing like a weed. And they watch with horror as our money is just given with one hand and then taken from the British people with the other. It doesn't, whether it's the farmers, whether it's the small businesses, whether it's the education sector, whether it's the pensioners. Why are you turning against decent British people?
Do you want to see an increase in the military spending of this country?
I want to see an increase in the military spending across Europe, Barry. As Chopper said, it needs to be Europe-wide.
Of course.
And by the way, Europe...
But do you want to see this country increase its military spending?
Not only has Europe created, but through its protectionism, a huge trade surplus with the USA.
Yeah,
we don't actually have it. Hang on.
Change the subject yet again,
no,
Rupert.
I'm not changing it. I'm not changing it. But quite rightly, Europe has taken advantage of America. Trump has had enough of that. So what we need to do is get around the table with Trump, respect the fact that he's the president of the USA. J.D. Vance is a very strong vice president, and stop virtue signaling. The truth is, Barry, we are not capable of waging war in Europe, and I object to the Prime Minister suggesting he's going to put boots on the ground.
No. And look,
Germany's not proposing...
You had left the chamber.
Germany's not proposing boots on the ground.
You had left the chamber this afternoon by the time the Prime Minister scotched that one very clearly. And that was when he was asked about the condition of boots on the ground.
He talked about boots on the ground.
And what he said after you had left the chamber was that there would not be any British boots on the ground unless there was a deal which was backed by America. That was very clear. So don't try and confuse the issue.
So we need not to criticise Donald Trump. We need to work with Donald Trump to create peace.
I haven't criticised Donald Trump. What I've said...
Hang on, most of your colleagues have in the past.
Okay, are you
David Lammy, Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting, almost all of you
Are you arguing with them or are you arguing with me at the moment? Again, don't shift the argument.
I'm not shifting
You're shifting it to somebody else. Let's just...
It's like being mauled by a dead sheep, Barry, coming from your side of the room.
As the war in Ukraine grinds into its third year, a significant portion of the British public is growing weary of indefinite financial and military aid commitments. While support for Ukraine remains strong in principle, recent polling and public sentiment suggest a preference for a lasting peace agreement rather than continued military assistance or temporary ceasefires. The growing perception is that Britain has already contributed significantly, and now the focus should shift to diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the conflict for good. The British government has walked a fine line, ensuring Ukraine is supported without directly engaging in the war. Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently reaffirmed that British troops will not be deployed on Ukrainian soil unless it is part of a coordinated NATO or US-led effort. This cautious stance reflects both strategic concerns and domestic pressures, with many voters increasingly critical of foreign military spending at a time of economic strain at home. A major sticking point for many Britons is the financial burden of international commitments. High taxation and cost of living pressures have led to a growing resentment toward large-scale government spending, especially when foreign aid and military support continue unabated, while waiting lists, public sector strikes, and energy bills dominate domestic concern. For years, Britain has played a key role in international aid and military assistance, but public patience is wearing thin. Many are now questioning whether the government should be focusing its resources closer to home. The argument is simple. Why fund foreign wars when basic public services are under immense pressure? While frustration with government spending is evident, another side of the debate has emerged. One that sees increased European military investment as essential. Defense analysts argue that Europe has long relied too heavily on U.S. military might, creating an economic and strategic imbalance. Countries across the continent, including Britain, are now being urged to increase defense budgets to ensure the continent can stand on its own in future conflicts, whether in Eastern Europe or the Indo-Pacific. Britain's role as a key NATO player means that ignoring defense investment is not an option. However, the challenge for Sunak's government is to convince the public that a stronger military budget aligns with Britain's long-term security and economic interests, rather than simply being another financial drain. With an election on the horizon, Britain's foreign policy approach will be under scrutiny. The government must strike a balance between maintaining its global commitments and addressing the domestic concerns of a taxed and financially squeezed electorate. The call for a permanent resolution in Ukraine rather than endless military spending reflects a wider shift in public opinion, one that demands a pragmatic and results-driven foreign policy. The challenge for Britain's leaders will be navigating this sentiment while upholding the country's position on the world stage. Whether through diplomacy, increased European military spending, or a recalibration of foreign aid priorities, one thing is clear, a border reporting can no longer afford to ignore the voices of its own citizens.
The Prime Minister had a good few days, absolutely, and very interesting to see the Prime Minister being so pro-American, so pro the meeting with Trump in the Commons. None of his backbenchers liked it, but ironically...
Oh, come on, they were cheering him and saying, here,
They didn't cheer him once. The only time they cheered the Prime Minister was when he attacked me.
What about the showdown in the White House on Friday, which I'm sure you saw, we all did?
Yeah.
Who was to blame for that?
Do you know what? We'll look back on it as being a blessing.
Why?
Put yourself in the mind of President Zelensky. He's going into the White House. He's being asked to sign an agreement that effectively says that Crimea is not coming back to the country. That was the mindset that Zelensky went in with. You could see his body language was very, very nervous. He found the whole thing difficult. There was a row with Vance. Trump snapped back at him. But you know what? Forget about that. The big picture is that peace is on its way, and that's what matters.
But do you not think that episode on Friday has damaged the search for peace?
No, the opposite.
Why is that then?
The opposite. Zelensky has, and by the way, I'm quoting Peter Mandelson here.
Peter Mandelson is not speaking for the government, as ministers have said today.
No,
Peter Mandelson was freelancing.
Zelensky needed to wake up and smell the coffee. And since that meeting, he's done so. By the way, I'm told from people inside the White House that before they left the building, Zelensky wanted to go back in and sign the deal.
In a high-profile meeting at the White House, the Prime Minister's overtly pro-American stance during discussions with former U.S. President Donald Trump has sparked mixed reactions at home and abroad. While some lauded his commitment to strengthening transatlantic ties, others criticized the approach as excessively deferential. Meanwhile, parallel negotiations over Crimea underscored the persistent difficulties in forging a stable and lasting peace in the region. As the conflict in Ukraine drags on, diplomatic urgency has intensified, particularly with regard to Crimea, which remains a geopolitical flashpoint. The Prime Minister, along with senior advisors, sought to advance negotiations that could pave the way for a framework of de-escalation. The stakes were high, as any misstep could further entrench hostilities or jeopardize fragile ceasefire arrangements. Sources close to the discussion suggested that while some proposals for de-escalation were put forward, deep divisions remained between the negotiating parties. The core issues, Ukraine's sovereignty, Russian territorial claims, and international security assurances, continued to fuel tensions. Washington signaled its willingness to reinforce its commitment to Kyiv, but the broader diplomatic landscape left room for skepticism over whether concrete solutions were within reach. Back in Kyiv, the reaction to the White House visit has been equally divided. Some political analysts argue that prioritizing U.S. support is crucial for Ukraine's long-term security, while others warn that an overly pro-American posture risks alienating European allies who advocate a more measured approach to negotiations. As Zelensky and his delegation concluded their visit, the outlook remained uncertain. While progress was made in establishing a diplomatic roadmap, the path to peace remains fraught with complexity. Whether the Prime Minister's strategy will yield tangible results or deepen geopolitical divides is yet to be seen. For now, the world watches as the high-stakes diplomatic game over Crimea continues to unfold. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to stay updated. Join our Telegram community for exclusive content and updates. Link below.